deconstructing the book Deconverted on today's Resonant Truth. Our topic for today is a review of a book, John, by two of my favorite authors, me and you. This book has just been released, and we're here to really talk about our perspectives, why we were interested in this topic, and our thought process as we navigated the research and the compilation of our thoughts on this particular area that I believe is very, very important for the church today. John, I have written all of one book. This is number 11 for you. So is numbers 5 through 10 easier than 1 through 5?
They get better, through the years as I get older and more sagacious. I still, with every book I write, I just really enjoy kind of investigating and going deeper into the topics. But yeah, I'm learning how to kind of, probe the research questions a little better and help that, get delivered onto the paper. So yeah.
I'm glad to hear it gets easier from here.
It's actually very addictive. I love it. It just makes my synapses go crazy, crack one there. And it's been great to work with a man as smart as you. You clearly and definitely had thought about the topic, deeply and comprehensively, which definitely was translated into print. And I think that the response that we've got from the book so far has been quite favorable, and for good reasons, because it's a thoughtful book. My mantra in my classes has always been be biblical, be evidential, and be kind. And I think you've done that well here. Although I still think the book is provocative enough to elicit some, different responses, which is good. That's part of the scholarly approach. The scholarly field is we are iron upon iron, sharpening each other. We're not supposed to be a polishing cloth. A polishing cloth does not sharpen iron. It just makes it shinier, but not necessarily sharper.
Agreed, very much so. Where would you like to start, sir?
The topic. What kind of elicited your sort of, interest in the topic?
The contemporary church is bleeding members. Those who are church-going members of the contemporary Christian church are reducing, and those who claim no spiritual faith category whatsoever, commonly referred to in the research world as nuns, N-O-N-E-S, are increasing. The atheists are the same today as in 1950, roughly about 4% of the population. But there has been a significant increase in people who choose not to identify with or express any faith. And so I wanted to take a look at why that phenomenon is really occurring. And I wanted to take a group that represented the most extreme element of that ideological shift, and that is the atheists. And so the research started with working with a number of atheist groups in my area. And the book characterizes the feedback that we got with that analysis. So the book really covers 3 major areas: my analysis of those interviews, the social, religious, and cultural milieu that I believe, given their feedback, may be exacerbating this ideological shift. And then the other thing that I really wanted to spend a significant amount of time on is what is the learning for the church as a result of my findings and as a result of our research.
So my second question was, and I think you just brought it up, is how can the book help pastors understand their congregations better and to actually meet their needs.
The thing that I believe that I wanted to emphasize, given the responses in the interviews, I really wanted to draw attention to the fact that the next wave of apostates, which is another name for people who have deconverted from Christianity to atheism, the next wave of apostates are sitting in the pews of the contemporary Christian church today. Very few, I can think of only one of the people that I interviewed where the deconversion process did not take years. And I believe that we've got something missing in the church today from a standpoint of discipleship, from a standpoint of ministering, and from a standpoint certainly of what is intended from a Christian apologetics perspective. We've got something missing that would allow that to happen, and allow that to happen to members over the course of years.
Right, and it was interesting. So when we got joined up in this project earlier, it was wonderful because my one of my first books that I wrote in 2016 was a book called Sacro-Egoism, which is talking about the radical individualism that has kind of, at that time, and actually that book was in 2016, and actually my study was in 2006, so it was even 10 years earlier, where this new kind of like radical, I don't say narcissistic, but it certainly has become that in many different congregations, approach to religion that people were adopting and sort of like forcing upon their congregations has come into full play right now. I was thinking about while you're talking about, the apostasy that's going on. What I found in the Pacific Northwest is there's more of a synchronicity or kind of synchronization that's going on. So I studied like 5 churches, and one of the churches I studied was the Presbyterian church in a town in Oregon, and they actually had brought in some Buddhist groups into the church and kind of incorporated. So it was like Buddhist Christianity, if you could even have that such thing, and of course you can't. But I think the radical individualism, definitely you see that with the deconverted, because they are making choices, and they are passing judgment, and then they are leaving, which is interesting and sad. I don't think Jesus is anti-individualism, because God wants people to make personal, private choices, but he wants them to make good choices and to choose him and to choose life. The Bible verse, Old Testament verse about choosing life. And so I saw the deconverted, and I've known many people who have, especially in academia, slipped off the orthodox, traditional Christian rails into this, whole new form, neo-Christianity, if you will, which is not Christianity at all. It's like what Paul says, it's another gospel. And so the radical individualism is definitely, I think, a key component of deconversion. My question to you about that radical individualism is that in your conversations with the deconverted people, did they speak in sort of radically individualistic ways, or was something else that they were focusing on when they said they were leaving the church?
Without a doubt, everybody had an individual story from what they were running to, John. That was significant, because it was obvious that all of them sought a replacement God with a little g. Some of them enjoyed the community aspect of Christianity, so they sought to replace that aspect of community with the atheist community. And so they were very active in atheist group membership, for example. Some of them did not turn their back on spirituality completely. And so some of them started exploring their definition of spirituality. And I'll be honest with you, one of the longest interviews that I had, I kind of set the expectation that most of these would be about 30 to 40 minute interviews. The longest I had took 2.5 hours. And that particular person spent a good deal of time explaining to me her interpretation of spirituality, given her exit from the transcendent perspective of Christianity. And I will tell you, that I spent a lot of time trying to understand the rationale behind that, and I'm not sure if I got much closer at the end of that particular conversation.
Right, and I did several, excuse me, I did several interviews too for mine, and I had the similar experience too. And they really were very eager and excited to kind of share their spiritual journey. But it was always so interesting because I always, as I listened to it, they always came back to themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this imminent sort of understanding, especially if God existed, then he would want this for me right now. And I do, like you, I mean, these are still good people, quote unquote, and they're not mean or vile or evil or anything like that. It just, they'd had hardships happen to them. A lot of my people they felt abused by the pastors and some of the leadership in the church. And some of them were just disappointed in life. And I always thought it was kind of funny though, because, they would say they didn't want a Santa Claus God, but in some ways they really did have this sort of like very kind of like unrealistic understanding, at least biblically so, of what it meant to be a Christian. And we're not, we're God walks us through the shadow of death and through the deserts, and sometimes he pulls us out of it, but ultimately, the human experience is here as the testing ground and a proving ground for our faith. And it's the thing that, our faith in God is to transcend everything else. And that was the thing I noticed too. The ones who were really disappointed and trying to change things up and reinvent, God had disappointed them. But their God, I was just thinking, I think it's by Phillips. There's a scholar who wrote on "Your God is too small,"
Mm-hmm.
and it was just that kind of mentality. And I do understand sorrow. I mean, it's not like I'm unknown, inexperienced with death and sorrow. Well, my wife and I, we've had like 7 miscarriages. My dad died like 20 years ago, way early, and we've had health issues. And my second son had to have heart surgery 4 days. So it's not like, my life is some sort of like fairy tale. I've had that too. But I remember, the night my father died, being in the room with him, and and he died of liver cancer, and it was pretty ugly. But he died. And I never, was mad at God for taking my father away, so to speak. In fact, I thanked him that he was, taking my father out of the pain. And then same thing with the miscarriages. It just was like, God wasn't an evil God for allowing that to happen, because there's some naturalistic, medical reasons why we had them too. So, but I never felt that sort of resentment. But I do notice these people, they do, at least in my studies, they had sort of a little bit of immaturity. It felt like, or at least a shallowness in their understanding of God. But I don't know if did your interviewers also have sort of that sort of like high emotion, sort of almost unstable, or at least maybe kind of like, I don't know, fiery temperament. I don't know.
Without a doubt, these were some of the most emotional conversations I think I've had with anybody in years. At least 3 people broke down in tears during the interview. I heard more vile cuss words than I would normally hear in a month. There was a great deal of anger. So there were kind of 2 general groups. One group that was mad at God, and John, you kind of hit on an area where we really want God to be a Santa Claus, and if he doesn't come through, then for some reason, every time, for some reason, that's evidence of his non-existence. There was one man that lost his job because of a mental illness related complication. And it destroyed him because he felt like that particular job was kind of his calling. And he struggled with his faith that he grew up with in dealing with that process. Another gentleman was a leader in a church, and his son died, obviously untimely, since it was his son, and he very much struggled with that. And this is one of those stories that made me angry toward the church, because in this particular situation, the church that he had gone to for years and he was serving in did not minister to him during this process. And he was one of the most vile, angry people that I spoke to in the process. And he certainly wasn't intending to port his anger at anybody other than God in that process. And he wasn't just an atheist. He had become an anti-theist, which means that he very much believes that religion, certainly Christianity, is in itself evil now. So
that's called being an evangelical atheist.
Yeah. Well,
they're out there, especially in the Pacific. I did my study in the Pacific Northwest. I live in Virginia right now. You live in North Carolina, so we're kind of in the Bible Belt right now. So it's not quite so bad here, but over there, wow, they are really vehement about their vitriol for God. And it's so funny, because I go, like, to me, God is such a cool guy. I mean, he's just awesome, and I really do think, whenever I've had, like, questions about my own vocational opportunities or identity, and it's just kind of frustrating. I still know God is always right, and he actually has my best interest in heart. And then it's okay to be afraid. I think it's okay to be depressed too, just because we don't have God's perspective fully like he has. But you do have to trust him. And that was the other thing, is the trust issue. I think people don't currently, they really don't trust God as much as they used to. It's like, say, in the 50s and 40s and 30s, which is sad, but I think also a part of culture. And I also wondered and heard in my own studies too, is that a lot of people would say they rejected Christianity, but what they really were rejecting was the Christian culture in their area. And I would always say to them, like, if I was having a conversation, I'd say, well, that's a church thing. I'm not sure that's a God thing, but they kind of equated the two. And I don't know, in your interviews, were they upset with the church culture, or was it more God they're upset with?
The other group, the first group was kind of upset with God. The other group certainly had issues with the church, but I don't think it was as much among the people that I interviewed, that it was the church culture, because there were a lot of aspects of the church culture that the people I talked to actually found very appealing. The fact that they were dealing with people of like mind, so they could be comfortable sharing things with them, versus maybe a family member that you don't want to share all of your all the skeletons in your closet with. They appreciated the sense of community. They appreciated that sense of positive perspective and positive outlook, and the sense of security. Those words were used as I kind of got them to open up about characterizing how they felt at the time, being part of the Christian worldview. The issue was that process let them down as they navigated through real life issues. There were a lot of comments about judgment, a lot of comments about hypocrisy. There were a lot of issues about lack of ministering. there were a lot of things that were really very preventable from my perspective. And for those to go on for years, those are the things that I think the church needs to really evaluate this phenomenon and say, what is wrong in our definition of discipleship that would allow that to happen? Are we more concerned about driving numbers into the seats as opposed to ministering to the people that are already in the seats, and let God deal with the numbers and the growth? Because I firmly believe that if the church spends more time preaching Christian truth, that growth is naturally going to happen, because America is definitely a country that is desperate to seek truth today.
Right, and I think you've hit on something right there, the truth part of it, and that's sort of it's called deontology, which is sort of a principle driven sort of mentality. We're really not that in America anymore. We're more ethical egoists. So it's kind of like well, this is just my sense of truth, or this is just that, you have the right to believe what you want to believe. I have the right to believe what I want to believe, and if you really love me, you'll let me believe whatever I want to believe, and I'll let you believe whatever you want to believe, which I call that self-serving altruism, which is just basically a barter system. And I think I saw that hugely at play in my own book, and I definitely read it in your book as well. But I think you mentioned they're profoundly disappointed, and I go, well, maybe your expectations are wrong. And I mean, I have to say this to myself all the time. So anytime I'm going through a transition period, I get all uppity, and I'll sit there and mature John, my split personality, says to young John, I go, you got to give people time to repent, right? Or consider the other person's position. Maybe there's something else going on in their life, and we're so kind of like myopically focused in our mirror that we forget how it's going to affect people. And I'm not saying that doesn't mean you can't do what you feel God calling you to do. But you also, I'm like if I have a prayer for God, and I know he could do it like that if he wanted to, but I also know, it's according to his will, and he's out there. There's 7 billion people on the earth, and he's trying to reach them all and work with people. So, I've kind of learned that I feel it's he more than deserves me being a little patient while he arranges the dominoes where he wants them to go, or the whatever it is, the jigsaw puzzle or the house that he's building, whatever metaphor you want to use. One thing I was thinking about, and I do have a master's in church history, and I love church history. I'm at my heart a historian, so I just love it. But I don't think deconversion is actually anything unique in church history. It's been around for a long time. And you talked about apostasy. Well, New Testament talks about that all the time. You have Peter and John and Paul talking about that. I think, though, culturally, and I think you could make an argument even against this mentality, excuse me, that it's happening more often, or there's not as much of a stigma with it, even within the church community, which I find very, very interesting. Because you mentioned, keisters in the seat. It's more about membership numbers than anything else. And for the sake of the number of people, they'll allow people to, believe certain things. Really good example, a horror story of sort of a congregational craziness that went on when we lived in Oregon. So we were attending this one church, which will name nameless, but the main pastor stepped down, and so an interim pastor took over for him. This guy was from the big branch, and he was probably in his 70s, early 70s, and the other former pastor was so full of vigor. He just was just passion. He just was really exciting, and this guy was just so boring, and he preached from the church constitution, and I'm like, we'd like to hear the Bible. And then the worst thing he did is they hired a new church secretary. And this was in Oregon, so this is not that big of a shock, but she was also into Wicca. So she was into witchcraft. And she asked him, she goes, is it okay for me to use the church, the sanctuary, to do a little Wicca celebration at lunchtimes? And the guy said yes. The pastor said yes. And then I was friends with the youth pastors there, and they said, when we heard it, we told him, what are you doing? You've let witchcraft into the temple. You can't do that. And the older guy said, well, when you're my age, you'll understand that stuff like this is okay. And, it's not okay, because you're not supposed to engage in satanic witchcraft. So all of the staff resigned, and we left that church too. But I think sometimes they're so key on not repulsing anybody, right? Or not saying no to anybody, that they'll allow anything in, out of peace. And I was just like going, oh my gosh, biblically, you're just not supposed to do that. So that's kind of one of my stories.
Completely agree. I do think there's one dynamic, John, that is unique to this time period. And your comment about deconversion has occurred throughout history. Well, that's undeniable. But I think there's something unique about the strategy that's occurring to actually penetrate the church and penetrate families now. And that attack is more aggressive than any time I've been on this earth. The activism that's being sold to children, kindergartners, first graders in school today regarding CRT and Marxism, the fact that the Southern Baptist Convention in 2019 would even pass a resolution that would consider something that is completely an ungodly ideology, such as critical race theory, that we could somehow, using the language at that time, use that as a measuring stick for us to evaluate the church strategy going forward. It's unfathomable that at any point in the past 50 years, with the leaders that we've had in the Christian in the Christian church in America, that something like that would have been passed. So there's something going on the outside and the strategy to get into the church, and there's something going on the inside that's allowing that to happen. In the book, let me just share this. In the book, John, we quote Paul Kigner, who is the author of The Devil and Karl Marx, talking about the curious relationship between communism, Marxism, and how they choose to try to manipulate the church. Though it has been long obvious to sentient human beings that communists hate religion, they nevertheless had an almost preternatural ability to enchant liberal Christians. They cynically, contemptuously targeted the religious left. They knew that progressive Christians shared certain sympathies with them: workers' rights, wealth redistribution, shrinking the income gap, denouncing the rich, fomenting class envy. I don't agree with all of those characterizations, but that's Paul Kigner's perspective. Communists exploited that trust, often invoking the language of social justice to enlist liberals in their petitions, their marches, their campaigns, and their objectives. And I think this is a situation where the dynamic of propaganda, which is candy-coated poison. If you take a look at propaganda, it always attempts to take something that all of us agree with, and Kingor mentioned a few of those, but yet the solutions to address those things are so problematic that today it literally goes against biblical truth, and in some cases against the Christian gospel, which is allowing people to experience cognitive dissonance between the cultural influence of what morality is and how it should be interpreted, and the biblical influence of morality and how it should be interpreted in our world today.
Right, and I think I completely agree with that. And I think, and I've taught history of Russia before for years, and one of the things is, like you talk about the Bolshevik Revolution in 1918. the propaganda that the Soviet Union spewed out would make it sound like everybody was on board and everybody was a Bolshevik, agreed with Lenin and Stalin's view of greater society. But the reality is that's not true. They were kind of like, I always envision it as a giant wave of discontent coming in, and the wave was not communism. The wave was just like, it's coming out of World War I, and the serfs still were doing really, really poorly, and you had this huge kind of rift between the really rich and the really poor. So then this wave, though, the communists actually were just surfing on top. So they surfed on top to power, and I think we kind of got a similar thing going on right now too, with the leftists. And people are they're it's kind of like, it's, I mean, if you're I think a what do they call it, a sentient, biblically knowledgeable Christian, you can see what's going on, because we've already been warned about this in the epistles, that people are going to abandon the good way for things that tickle their own ears. And so I think you have that right now. And again, like I said, go back to the radical individualism. We've been taught that people's social avenues should always be open, and there's nothing that should ever get in the way. Now you see it right now with transgenderism, right? And you also see it with abortion, and I do love freedom, I do, and liberties, but our liberties can't come at the cost of someone else's slavery or someone else's death. And definitely, we're here to protect the children, but that's actually who, and this is, of course, psychologically, I understand why they do it. The Marxists and the leftist Christians, and I use that term loosely, they come after the children because they're the most vulnerable, and they're also the ones who actually, let's face it, are seeking freedom and experience, just being young. But a big question I have, and I just have a couple more questions to ask you. I want to make sure we get to. So one is we'll do this last two. What objections with these postmodern liberal Christians have about what you say in our book? What would upset them the most? What would they find just completely anathema?
I think probably any aspect of our characterization of their motivation and the defense of their decision. And let me explain what I mean by the second part of that. There wasn't a single person that gave me any evidence. And John, I tried to craft questions to hit this in a couple of different angles, but nobody gave me any evidence that supported their presuppositional shift. Basically, they decided they didn't like God anymore, and they didn't want to be a Christian anymore, and that was it. So all of the evidence that exists in support of the Christian worldview literally all of a sudden disappeared. And as I tried to get and dig into what evidence supported really the atheist worldview, just as the atheist really tries to put the responsibility on the theist to justify their belief, they do not believe that they've got the responsibility to justify their non-belief. So I think they would probably, have an issue with that. I tried to honor the answers that I got. I tried not to proselytize during these interviews. So I really wanted them to have a chance to tell their story. But as I took a look at the analysis of all of the answers, I felt the ammunition that supported such a monumental ideological shift in their life to be lacking, other than for it to be based on emotion and based on something that they were running away from versus something that they were running toward. I tried to fairly characterize that in the book, but I think probably any attempt to characterize that from a learning perspective or an analysis perspective may be an area where they would push back.
C.S. Lewis?
Yes.
Have you ever read Brief Observed?
I have not.
So it's a fantastic book. It's just so visceral and so honest. That's the thing I really like about C.S. Lewis, is that he's just so brilliant, but he still voices these concerns that other people have. So if you know anything about him, he was a psycho introvert. So when he finally got married to a woman named Joy, it was just like this huge breakthrough for him. But then she dies early, and it just crushes him. And that's like, you talk about the former pastor who lost his son, and just that just agony that he experienced. Well, C.S. Lewis experienced that too. In fact, in A Grief Observed, it's not an easy read. It's a shorter book, but it's still a hard read. Hard read to do. But he said the death of a beloved is an amputation, and so you just feel that loss. And then he goes, and then later on he'll say, and he goes, "Talk to me about the truth of religion, and I'll listen gladly. Talk about the duty of religion, and I'll listen submissively. But don't come talking to me about the consolations of religion, or I shall suspect that you don't understand." And I think that is definitely something that I heard in sort of echoes in the transcripts of your interviews, that these people, they had these really hard things happen to them, and what they thought, I think their expectation of the peace of God that would come upon them did not happen the way they wanted it to. And so that really made them upset with God, and just sort of like, really resentful of him. Now, interestingly, toward the end of the book of Grief Observed, C.S. Lewis comes to grips with what's going on in his life, and he understands everybody is mortal, everybody dies, And the other thing he says, he goes, "Of course I did not hear God, because how can a person hear God when they're always yelling at him?" They don't listen for God, they just yell at him too. And that reminded me of Ecclesiastes, right? In Ecclesiastes, he tries all these things to find fulfillment on the earth, right? But the only fulfillment, true, lasting, enduring fulfillment, comes from God, a relationship with God. And you get to the end of Ecclesiastes, he goes, "Here's what you want to do: work hard, stay with the woman you marry in your youth, and love God." And so those are the things. And I think that's the part these people are missing. And and I think we talked about this before in other conversations, but it's a form of idolatry. And whether the idolatry is self-idolatry or experiential idolatry, you have a master's in apologetics, is that right?
Yes.
So so the three main apologetic approaches are presuppositionalism, evidentialism, and experientialism. Well, right now they're in experientialism, and that's the one I lean upon least of all, because I'm such a neurotic flake. So I'll sit there and I'll get all up, like I said, uppity or depressed or something like that, and I'll step back, I'll say, okay, wait a minute, let's not be so emotional about this. What's really going on here? And that's where I get the evidential part, and then I'll go to the Bible and read about God's promises for us, and then I'll calm down, and then I will have that peace. So no matter what happens to me, I mean, I'm not necessarily going to be comfortable, but it's not necessarily about comfortability. It's about doing the right thing and loving God with all your heart, mind, soul, body, and strength, and loving your neighbor as yourself. So I have it. Okay, so last question. Okay, this is going to be a tough one, and this is actually, it kind of goes back to like how do you help pastors? So with all the information you learned and gained while researching your topic, okay, what would be the most productive approach or a way to engage with people who are considering deconversion?
I think there's three parties in the process that I want to kind of address in that. John, for the former Christian themselves, I think they tend to put too much emphasis on the Christian instead of Christ. Was listening to Frank Turek's podcast the other day, and Frank used this as an analogy. Mozart was completely talented, had a great mind, was a great musician. But if I went over to the piano that's right around the corner from me and tried to play Mozart, it would absolutely be horrible. Well, who's at fault in that situation? Would you blame Mozart because I completely destroyed his work of art? And I think the prospect apostate, that person sitting in the pew today that is struggling with the potential of deconversion, if you're analyzing the church as a point of concern for you, make sure that you put your focus on Christ and the work of art as opposed to the Christian that is struggling with difficulties and issues just like you are.
I also think, if you're so self-absorbed, it's just kind of like C.S. Lewis said, he was screaming all the time. He could never hear God. So and that's the thing. It's just, what we do to ourselves and to our mental, machinations, we could just stir this nasty pot and just be constantly stirring, right? And we keep throwing things in there, and making it worse. It's like, if the book of Job, it's talking about the tempest, the whirlwind. He's in a whirlwind, and it's kind of weird and kind of like very, I don't say suicidal, but it's so harming. We stay in this deep, dark pit, and God's got this giant hand reaching down to us, and he's like, hey, look up here. And we just stay focused on that. But that goes along with the radical individualism. We're taught that culturally, that's what you're supposed to do. Right. And we're going to have some other speakers coming up here pretty soon, but, and some of them have said, stop focusing so much on yourself. You're being kind of flaky, and that's the postmodern congregation does not want to hear that. And I don't know, I'm sure you've gone to church for a while too. I remember one former pastor, it was a great sermon, and he was talking about sinfulness, and he pointed to the congregation. He goes, you guys, some of you got a real bad problem with this. You're not being Christ-like. You're not being loving. You're being like the Pharisees, and you should stop it. Oh man, did he get grief for that though? They're like, my dad has been a deacon for years, and the whole family, and blah blah blah. But they were so stuck in themselves, and they weren't seeing the bigger picture, which is the focus on God. And he's a person who loves and cares for you, and he's got a perfect perspective. And so you just gotta, when you start to freak out, just focus on that and know that no matter what, and ultimately, let's face it too, ultimately, we're all going to die. That's the biggest crisis of all, it's like, and he's going to get us through that too. So I hear you saying, don't focus on the crisis, focus on Christ.
I think the second learning is for the church itself. I'll reiterate that the deconversion process for the vast majority of the people that I spoke to took years. If that's happening, then that's a reflection that our sense and interpretation and obligation of discipleship is just simply poor in the church today. Discipleship does not occur on the macro level. Discipleship occurs on the micro level. It occurs one individual at a time. And when we've got churches more concerned about numbers, then we're going to be less concerned about souls and the individuals and their individual stories and their individual challenges and their individual journeys. Our Sunday school classes, our men's and women's groups, the deacons, we've got so many different elements in the church that need to evaluate their interpretation of what discipleship means in their church today. Final item regarding the church is regarding apologetics, John. You mentioned I've got my master's in apologetics. I went into that particular program thinking that apologetics was really to prepare for YouTube debates and to argue on the streets with the anti-theists And while certainly that exists and that's fun for all of us to watch, that's not, I'm convinced now, that's really not the ultimate and primary purpose of apologetics. I'm convinced now more than ever that apologetics is critical for the Christian as much as it is for the non-Christian. Apologetics gives us the what to go with our why. Or in other words, there is ample and abundant reason to defend and support the Christian faith. And if you do not have that in support of your faith, then all that you've got left is your emotion. All that you've got left is your human response to a situation that is void of the power of God's work in your life and the power of the Holy Spirit.
Apologetics is thinking, though. We're not a thinking culture anymore. I mean, you talk about when we were younger, because we're both 50s or something, and so you remember you're saying, "Hey, get off the boob tube, go out and play outside." You remember that? It's just that we were watching TV for average kid watch like 10 hours of TV a day or something like that, and we're supposed to get out. It's even worse now. And people are doing social media, they're on the internet, they're playing computer games, and they're so passive, letting the world kind of pour into them and not having any filter system. So when we talked about the three things, presuppositionalism, which is their big ideas that are already in play that you can count on. Evidentialism is that the facts kind of should direct truth and correct lifestyle. But experientialism is that emotionalism. So, but the thing is, though, is if you are intellectual and you do try to be knowledgeable. So pietism, Jakob Spinner, I think it was 17th century, maybe 16th century. He tried to he saw the sort of liberal privatization of religion. So he was trying to help people balance it. So he says, okay, here's what I want you to do. You're going to take it personally. That's great, but it's got to be productive. You also have to be knowledgeable. And that's what you're talking about, apologetics, how to defend the faith and understand the faith. I mean, how illiterate, how ignorant are people about systematic theology, church history, soteriology, pneumatology, all the different ologies? They have no clue. But they don't even really want to, because it makes them, maybe it feels like they're in school again. And I remember my renaissance, as they would say in England, happened in like freshman year in college, because I had he happened to be my history teacher at a professor at Oregon State University, but he came in, he spoke to our college class on the canon of scripture, and it just blew my socks off. And so I started a Bible study group, and I said, well, let's do that. I go, and it started with like 4 guys, and I go, let's just work through the Gospels, and then we'll talk about like authorship, themes, all the different components that go into that. And within like 3 weeks, we had like 30 guys there, because they were learning this stuff about how the Bible came together, the canon, and why it's so important.
There's 2 problems with that, John, before we get into the last part of my answer to your question, which was really a good question. One, without a doubt, and this is certainly the case, I think, for the what's referred to as the mega churches. I think you've got ministers today in the pulpit that enjoy being the guy on stage, but I'm not sure if they really have a grasp anymore in what it means to be a spiritual leader. Let me read to you. Michael Brown posted on his website a couple of days ago the results of a poll from pollster George Barna, who works with the Arizona Christian University, found that just 37% of Christian pastors in the United States have a biblical worldview. 37%. Now, this article describes, it's one thing for believers sitting in the pew to reflect a percentage like that, but this is for the people in the pulpit. And in the words of Barna, this is another strong piece of evidence that the culture is influencing the American church more than Christian churches are influencing the culture.
You're in seminary now, and I was in seminary 20 years ago, and I still think where you're going is still a very good place, and there's not, I teach classes with them too, so we're not heretics or anything like that, but there's definitely a difference in the way that people approach the faith, and so you have this, there's sort of like a reticence or hesitance for pastors to be like Spurgeon's, or Moody's. Something else that C.S. Lewis said that I thought was really relevant to this, and it's something that I kind of wonder if there's a trust issue. There's a trust issue that people have today. They don't trust their pastors. They don't trust institutions. They don't trust God. And I think it's a lot of it, they don't perceive him. They don't feel his presence for whatever reason. But and that makes them sad. And it does. And C.S. Lewis said, again, in A Grief Observed, he says, no one ever told me that grief felt so much like fear. And we're not supposed to be fearful. So, and I think people do, because I think the focus is switched from Christ to other things that are not as important or not as a high priority. And like you had mentioned, you very beginning of our talk, it's not about numbers per se. It's about the right people and who God uses, and you look out there and you go, oh, if I was a good pastor, I'd have like 250 people, or if you're a mega church pastor, you'd say I'd have 25,000, not 10,000. But that fear is there, and of course, God commands us to fear not.
So the third learning, I think, John, for the church and the third party involved in this is for the Christian. And I think the learning and the feedback is that you are called to ministry. Now, you are not necessarily called into the ministry, and by that I mean from a vocational perspective. But 1 Peter 4:10 discusses how you as a Christian are given gifts for a very specific reason. And so it's vitally important that everybody in the church understands that it's not just the deacon's role or the pastor's role to make sure that you are discipling and ministering to the person sitting in the pew with you. Thanks for joining our podcast today. Check the links below on how to purchase a copy of Deconverted, as well as the library of books written by John S. Knox, including the book he mentioned today, Sacroegoism. As we grow our channel and podcast, it helps if you subscribe and hit the like button below, so we would appreciate that. And we have a number of amazing guests in the days ahead, so continue to monitor our channel for new content. One note to wrap up our discussion from today. Keep in mind that Jesus said that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. So while there was every expectation, and there continues to be every expectation that we will be under constant spiritual attack, you've got to keep one thing in mind. Evil does not win, and the church of the living God will never be defeated. The question is, what side of the battle will you be on? Our prayers for you and your family in these dark days. Just remember, while culture attempts to attack and label you with all sorts of hate and mockery, as the writer of Romans says, if God is for us, who can possibly be against us? Thanks for joining us today.